Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you can hear me. Thank you for joining us for the next in the series of Beale & Company's construction law updates, following our recent webinar on the NEC3 professional services contract, which can be viewed via a link on our website. This time, the subject is the NEC3 engineering and construction contract, which dominates the infrastructure sector in the UK market and numerous overseas markets. Bear with me while we get to a position where I can scroll through, and here we are, off we go. So in the usual format, we will start with some brief introductions. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tom Pemberton. I'm a partner and a member of the construction team at Beale & Company. I'm joined by my colleague, James Vernon, a senior associate in the team. James and I are very pleased to have so many of you attending this webinar. We have just over 150 people joining us, which is fantastic. Before we start, I would like to deal with the usual housekeeping items. Now, this webinar is scheduled to last approximately 1 hour. During the webinar, you can submit questions to us in the appropriate box on the right-hand side of your screen. We will try to deal with these during the webinar at the end of the session, if time permits. Otherwise, we'll come back to you in the next few days where possible. So looking at the webinar outline, over the next hour, James and I will be providing the first of 2 webinars giving an overview of the ECC form. This will involve us providing an introduction to the ECC and commenting on its use in the current market, providing an overview of the structure of the form, including its various components which need to be completed and tied together to form a contract. Casting a spotlight on a number of the characteristic provisions of the NEC3 ECC form, including those relating to cooperation, programming, key dates, completion, design liability, limitation of liability generally, early warning, compensation events, risks, insurance and dispute resolution. You'll note that payment is not on the list. This is a major topic in its own right, which we propose to focus on in our second webinar, together with the role of the project manager, which will draw together many of the themes which we'll be considering in both webinars. We'll refer to a number of recent cases as we review each area of the form, and we will draw some interim conclusions before bringing this webinar to a close. And I should mention also, we'll be giving you a number of practical tips on how best to ensure compliance with the obligations of the contractor, for those of you who are contractors listening, and the obligations of the project manager, for those of you who are project managers. The latter mainly a focus of the second webinar. Although the ECC has a relatively short history, going back to the first edition of the new engineering contract, which was published in 1993, it is now one of the most widely used engineering construction contract forms in the UK. And one of the reasons for its popularity, no doubt, are that its original authors went back to the core principles of aiming to achieve flexibility, simplicity and clarity, and to provide a stimulus to good management, in a deliberate effort to overcome what were perceived as the shortcomings of the then dominant forms, including the ICE civil engineering contracts, now of course rebadged as the ICC civil engineering contracts. The ECC is widely used in the procurement of water treatment facilities, power generation and nuclear decommissioning projects, roads, rail and airport projects, environment agency projects such as flood prevention and major projects generally. Following the use of the ECC on the High Speed 1 project, the Channel Tunnel link, it is expected to be used for the High Speed 2 projects. The ECC was endorsed by the Office of Government Commerce a few years ago and remains a contract of choice by the UK government for its construction projects. It's also designed for international use, as indicated by the fact that it provides for the choice of governing law and language to be inserted in the contract data part 1. Overseas clients who use the ECC for their major development programs include the governments of Hong Kong and New Zealand, among others, Eskom, Anglo Platinum Mining, Transnet, and the ABSA Bank of South Africa. Many of you will be familiar with the various components of an ECC contract, so we'll be showing these key features in the following slides without much comment. With regard to the contract data part 1, this is an essential part of the contract to be provided by the employer, giving details of the main and secondary option clauses selected for the contract, and other essential information, including the starting and completion dates, whichever main option is used, the level of delay damages if option X7 is used, and so forth. As regards to contract data part 2, this is to be provided by the contractor, including information about the contract's design, and pricing information, including the direct fee percentage and subcontracted fee percentage, and other cost components, including hourly rates for design work. Now, the works information is the key document which describes and specifies the works, and it also includes a host of other information, much of which is referenced in the core clauses. For example, its restrictions on access, health and safety requirements, any design brief for the contractor designed works, if applicable, together with any procedures which the contractor is to follow in carrying out his design. There's a useful key to the works information cross-references in the guidance notes, which should be referred to both by the project manager in preparing the works information and by the contractor in considering the tender documents. The site information should include information about the site derived from investigations, boreholes, surveys, and other reports. The schedule of the cost components, which include the main schedule and the shorter schedule, which may be used as an alternative, set out what is included as the defined costs for people, equipment, plants and materials, charges and utilities, and manufacture and fabrication design, among other things. This is used for assessing compensation events in relation to all major options, and the price for work done to date in relation to work which is not subcontracted for options C to E. The other options I'm briefly going to have a look at now without much comment, other than to say that they are characteristic of the NEC3 emphasis on flexibility. So in selecting an ECC contract form, it's obviously essential, first of all, to select a main option, which is to apply for that particular contract. And they all include payment provisions which are specific to the option and related terms, including respective compensation events and other matters. As well as the main option clauses, it's important to choose the appropriate dispute resolution clause, which James will be coming back to later in this webinar. There's also a multiplicity of secondary option clauses which have to be selected as appropriate. Now, it's possible to have an ECC contract without any secondary option clauses, but almost invariably at least some of those options, but by no means all, are normally selected. And we'll be coming back to a few of those options in the course of this webinar. There is also a selection of option Y clauses, which are primarily intended to be incorporated where the project is in the UK, since in the cases of YUK2 and YUK3, they reflect specific UK laws. Option Y UK1, Project Bank Account, is not UK specific, but reflects initiatives to improve the payment processes in the UK, led by a number of government departments, including the Highways Agency and the Environment Agency. We turn now to look at some of the characteristic provisions of the ECC form, starting with clause 10.1, which imposes obligations on all the key players in an ECC contract to act as stated in the contract and in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. The effect of the equivalent clause in an NEC3 term service contract was considered in the case of Mears versus Shoreline last year. Now, Shoreline was a landlord with around 8,000 social housing units in the UK. Mears successfully tendered to provide repair and maintenance services for those units as the contractor. It turned out that the pricing mechanism set out in the contract was incomplete and unworkable, so the parties subsequently agreed to ignore this and to work to composite call-out rates on an informal basis. However, the parties ended up in dispute after Shoreline realised that it was not achieving the cost savings it had anticipated, and it informed Mears that it would be looking to recover some what it regarded as overpayments arising from the use of the composite call-out rates on past invoices. Mr. Justice Aikenhead noted the spirit of partnership started to break down at that stage, which was possibly something of an understatement. Mears argued that by departing from commercially agreed but not contractual terms, Shoreline was acting a breach of clause 10.1. The court held that Mears was not liable to repay the amounts overpaid by Shoreline to date on the basis of estoppel principles. However, Mr. Justice Aikenhead found that clause 10.1 did not override the express terms of the contract, including an entire agreement clause. This finding was consistent with earlier case law. For example, in the case of TSG Building Services versus South Anglia, it was held that an obligation to work together and individually in a spirit of of trust, fairness and mutual cooperation did not override a contractual right to terminate at will. It follows that the obligation to act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation has little or no effect independently of the underlying obligations. This is consistent with the historic reluctance of the English courts to import overriding good faith obligations into commercial contracts. However, this does not mean that clause 10.1 should be ignored by the parties. In considering whether there has been a breach of their underlying contractual obligations, a relevant factor will be whether the parties have acted in accordance with this clause or have attempted to gain advantage by means that are inconsistent with acting in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. We turn now to some key liability aspects of the ECC form. First of all, looking at the issue of contract design, and in particular, is there an implied fitness of purpose obligation? Now, the contractor's primary obligation under the form generally is to provide the works in accordance with the works information. Where the works information states that he's designing any parts of the works, it is clear from the definition of to provide the works that this includes design. So in many cases, the contractor will have a significant measure of design responsibility. In these cases, in the absence of express terms qualifying the design obligation, the contractor will normally have an implied fitness for purpose or FFP obligation to the extent that it is responsible for design, as was established in the House of Lords case of IBA versus EMI in 1980, and which has been followed in a number of subsequent cases. For example, the relatively recent case of Baylis Farms and RB Dimert Builders in 2010. Now, given that most contractors will be relying on their design consultants to carry out any necessary design, and also that the contractor and the design consultants will be relying on their respective professional indemnity insurance policy to cover their design liability, and the fact that FFP obligations are not covered by PI insurance, the contractor should ensure in all applicable cases that a secondary option X15 is incorporated. Now, looking at option X15, the detailed wording of that option, there are a number of peculiarities. For a start, it reverses the normal burden of proof, such that the contractor has the burden of proving compliance rather than the usual position where the employer has the burden of proving breach. This is not normally seen as an issue for professional indemnity insurers, but it does highlight the importance for the contractor and its design consultants of keeping proper records of all its design activities, since in the absence of having contemporaneous records, it's going to be extremely difficult to prove compliance with the obligation to use reasonable skill and care. Another feature is that options X15 does not cover the contractor's liability for any design information which has been included in the works information, which then subsequently proves to be defective. Owing to the way that option X15 is drafted, there is a risk that the contractor could have a residual FFP obligation in relation to such information. The ECC is silent on this point, and it would be wise to obtain advice on the possible risk exposure where the contractor has provided design information which has been included in the works information. Now, turning from design liability to limitation of liability generally, most contractors, particularly I have to say those in the process industries and their joint venture partners, regard limitation of liability as an essential part of their risk management policies. However, under the ECC, the contractor's liability is only limited if option X18 is incorporated. While this is largely self-explanatory, option X18 has a number of peculiarities which leave the contractor exposed to the risk of liability for higher amounts than appears at first sight, or even uncapped amounts for certain categories of loss. Looking at clause X18.1, for example, note that the exclusion of liability for the employer's indirect or consequential loss typically does not cover liability for loss of the employer's profit, revenue, loss of use, etc., which are typically found to be direct losses. While such losses would be covered by the aggregate cap on liability under option X18.4, which we'll look at in a moment, if the contractor wishes to exclude liability for such losses, clause X18 30.1 must be amended accordingly. Now, looking at Clause X or Option X 18.3, the contractor's liability to the employer for defects due to his design, which discovered before the defect date, is not limited. So this is not a simple cap on design liability. Again, to be noted, although it should be covered by the aggregate cap, there is no separate cap on what might be called liability for patent defects as opposed to latent defects caused by the contractor's design. Looking at option X 18.4, there are a number of excluded matters for which the contractor's liability would be uncapped. Now, first of all, X 18.4 is an extremely important clause because it does start by capping the contractor's total liability to the employer for all matters arising under or in connection with these with the contract, but it's other than the excluded matters, so these have to be looked at with some care. Typically on a major project, or contractors look to negotiate separate caps or subcaps for at least some of the excluded matters, including delay damages, for example, and if applicable, low performance damages, and even for the contractor's share of any pain if there's been a cost overrun under an option C or an option D contract. Whereas this is the case, then option X18 does need to be reviewed, and if agreed, amended to provide for those excluded matters either to be brought within the overall cap or to be subject to separate caps. Now, option X 18.5 gives the option for the parties to include a contractual cut-off date for claims in the contract data, which is earlier than the date prescribed by the Limitation Acts, which should normally be 12 years from completion, or possibly the defect date, assuming the contract has been executed as a deed. I've seen it happen that employers have sometimes tried to extend the statutory limitation period so that it's longer than the 12 years prescribed by the Limitation Acts. Where this is the case, the drafting has to be handled with extreme care, and of course the contractor has to make due risk allowance in its tender where appropriate. Turning now to the programme obligation set out in section 3 of the ECC, these are at the core of the contract and its focus on effective project management. Now, pursuant to clause 50.3, if no programme is identified in the contract data, 1/4 of the price for work done to date is retained in assessments of the amount due until the contractor has submitted a first programme to the project manager for acceptance, showing the information which the ECC contract requires. This is clearly quite an effective incentive, if operated, for the contractor at least to submit a programme for acceptance. Acceptance by the project manager is of course another thing, and it's not unusual for acceptance to be withheld sometimes until the end of the project if the project manager does not consider that the programme complies with the ECC requirements. So clause 31.2 sets out an extensive list of information which the contractor must show on its programme, and going into far greater detail than is the case in other construction contract forms. However, the ECC does not prescribe a particular methodology for preparing the programme, nor even that it must identify the critical path. Any requirements of this nature should be specified in the works information. Clause 31.3 sets out a procedure for the acceptance or the non-acceptance of the contractor's programme by the project manager, who can refuse to accept the programme, for example, if the contractor's plans are not practicable, if the programme does not show the information which is required by clause 30.1.2, or the programme does not represent the contractor's plans realistically, or otherwise it does not comply with the works information. Clause 32 sets out obligations on the contractor to revise the programme at regular intervals and whenever required to do so by the project manager. Now, the programme has particular significance for the assessment of compensation events, both in terms of the disruptive effect and the cost thereby incurred by the contractor, and the delay to the completion and the date and the key dates. Clause 63.3 provides that a delay to the completion date is assessed as the length of time that, due to the compensation event, planned completion is later than a planned completion as shown on the accepted program. So the accepted program has a very important status for the purpose of assessing extension of time, and not only extension of time but additional cost under section 6. Now, if a program has not been accepted by the project manager, so there isn't an accepted program, clause 64.2 provides that the project manager assesses a compensation event using his own assessment of the program for the remaining work. If, as I've said, there is no accepted program, or the contractor has not submitted a program or alterations to a program for acceptance as required by the contract. Now, to avoid disputes over the project manager's assessment of the program, it is accordingly in all parties' interest to cooperate to ensure that there is an up-to-date accepted program at all times. Now, looking at the contractor's completion obligations, completion is defined as the date when the contractor has done all the work which the works information states he is to do by the completion date. There are a couple of other factors as well in the definition of completion, but it follows from this that the works information should set out a statement of the work which the contractor must complete in order to qualify for a completion certificate. This is an example of details which must be considered for inclusion in the works information, although in this case the definition does provide a fallback in the cases where the works information does not include the necessary information. Now, it's important to ensure in nearly all cases that option X7 is incorporated in the contract. That's the secondary option X7, since otherwise the contractor will be liable for general damage of delay, i.e. all the losses which the employer can prove it has incurred as a result of the delay in achieving completion. In the case of a major project, such as a nuclear decommissioning or a nuclear new build project, the employer's losses could be astronomical and far beyond what the contractor is able to contemplate or manage. So this underlines that the importance of ensuring that option X7 is incorporated. In other forms, of course, the IC forms and the ICC and JC forms, liquidated damages are an integral part of the form, whereas in the ECC, they're only a secondary option. So looking at a distinctive feature of the form which relates to key dates. Now, these are relevant only if identified in the contract data. On many projects, they will not be needed. According to the ECC guidance notes, they're appropriate for projects where more than one contractor is appointed by the same employer on the same project. They should accordingly facilitate the coordination of the respective work packages. Given that the condition required to achieve a key date will normally be short of completion, it will be important to define the required condition in a sufficiently precise way to avoid later disputes as to whether the condition has been achieved. Now, the contractor's liability for the employer's additional costs resulting from a failure to achieve the required condition by a key date is a significant risk. The contractor's liability would not be liquidated and would be uncapped, except to the extent that it is covered by an aggregate cap on its liability under clause X18. So when tendering, the contractor should request information about the likely consequences of failure to meet a key date. If appropriate, it should consider requesting an option Z clause, capping its delay, daily and overall liability under clause 25.3 at an agreed maximum amount in order to mitigate the risk under this clause. Just going to say something briefly about a risk register and early warning, both of which are characteristics of the strong focus of the ECC form on risk management. One point on that slide which I would highlight is that it's important to note that the risk register does not change the apportionment of risks provided by section 8 of the form. It should, however, assist the parties to identify risks at an early stage of the project and to take appropriate steps or to avoid or mitigate them and to manage them where they arise. Although again, I would emphasise that the risk register in a sense can't be seen as a contractual document. James will be coming to the issue of risk, who apportions as risks, and of course the related topic of insurance at a later point in this webinar. Now, related to the risk register, there is a requirement under clause 16 of the ECC to give early warning of the events shown in this slide. This early warning requirement should not be confused with a separate requirement to notify compensation events under clause 61. Now, the early warning procedure was an innovative feature of the ECC, which is often now found in non-NEC3 contexts. It gives some teeth to the obligation in clause 10.1 to act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation, since failure to give an early warning of compensation event will be taken into account by the project manager if he decides that the contractor did not give an early warning of the event which an experienced contractor could have given. In this case, he assesses the compensation event as if the contractor had given early warning. This could significantly reduce the contractor's entitlement if action could have been taken to avoid or reduce the effects of the compensation event if early warning had been given. Looking now at the compensation event procedure, as noted in the slide, this is fundamental to the operation of the ECC. Now, 19 compensation events are listed in clause 60.1 of the ECC form. Frequently they are amended. For example, few employers are prepared to accept prevention for compensation events set out in clause 60.1(19), either at all or without substantial amendment. Any amendment should of course be fully considered by contractors at tender stage. Now, an important feature of the ECC is that each compensation event potentially results in the contractor being entitled to claim both additional time and money. This distinguishes the ECC forms from other forms such as JCT, where typically there is a longer list of delay events than additional money events. Now, as noted on the slide, the detailed rules governing the assessment of additional time and cost following the notification of compensation of a compensation event will be considered at more length in a future webinar. Here we limit ourselves to looking at a couple of key points arising from the compensation event procedure, and notably the 8-week time bar under clause 61.3. It's critical that the contractor notifies compensation events within that 8-week period, since failure to do so could have seriously damaging consequences. Now, if the contractor does not notify a compensation event within that 8-week period, he's not entitled to a change in the prices, the completion date, or a key date, unless the event arises from the project manager or the supervisor giving an instruction, issuing a certificate, changing an early decision, or correcting an assumption. Now, clause 61.3 is almost certainly an effective time bar, which would prevent the contractor from being entitled to any compensation or extension of time if it fails to a compensation event within the 8-week period. But the question arises, is the time bar effective even if the time bar if the compensation event itself is a breach of contract by the employer? Now, the Commonwealth courts have refused to uphold contractual time bars in these circumstances, following the prevention principle, which means that an employer cannot benefit from its own breach. For example, in the Australian case of Gamemark, it was held that liquidated damages were irrecoverable when the contractor had failed to serve as notice in time, and in fact time had become at large as a result of that finding, and the completion date could not be identified. However, nearer at home, the courts in Scotland and England have taken a harder line enforcing contractual time bars in this situation, on the basis that the contractor's loss was caused by its failure to serve an appropriate notice in due time. The case of City Inn and Multiplex are relevant in this connection. So contractors should make sure they notify compensation events promptly after becoming aware of them, otherwise there is a risk of losing their contractual entitlements. The question does arise of who does need to be aware of the compensation event in order to set the 8-week period running as referred to in clause 61.3. And the key is to identify the direct in mind within a company. Some guidance on this was given but in the case of Bolton and Graham, where it was stated that people who are, in the young language of the day, mere servants and agents, who are nothing more than hands to the work, cannot be said to represent the mind or will of the company, and it's not their awareness which is relevant here. The awareness we're talking about is the awareness of the managers and directors of the company. It follows that if an operative on site becomes aware of circumstances which amount to a compensation event, his awareness is not the trigger for setting the 8-week notification period running. This occurs when the event comes to the attention of a person with management responsibility. I'll just say something briefly about the time bars applicable to project managers, and Section 6 of the ECC form does include some deadlines which, if they're not met by the project manager, can result in a compensation event being deemed to have occurred or a quotation by the contractor being deemed to have affected. However, under the dispute resolution provisions in options W1 and W2, the adjudicator is empowered to alter a quotation which has been treated to having been accepted. This would be seriously embarrassing for a project manager to be the cause of an adjudication as it resulting from its failure to respond to a notification or a contractor's own quotation in due time, and it could of course be prejudicial to the employer. But it does highlight that the risk borne by project managers as employers is not equivalent in this case to the contractor's failure to notify within the contractual time bar under clause 61.3. So the above summary has highlighted some of the potentially onerous administrative burdens of operating the compensation procedure for both the contractor and the project manager. And it's not unusual for the parties to vary the procedure and or to relax the timescales. For example, to agree for retrospective assessment of compensation events rather than prospective assessment. Now, any variation should be recorded in an agreement between the employer, the project manager, and the contractor, if not set out in the option Z clauses at the outset, to avoid the risk of later disputes as to whether the compensation event has in fact procedure has in fact been varied or has been operated correctly. Now, that's all I've got to say at this point in the webinar, and I'll hand over to James for him to take us forward.
Thanks, Tom. I'm now going to look at the risk allocation and insurance pursuant to Section 8 and the dispute resolution options in accordance with either W1 or W2. Starting with risk allocation, as we all know, appropriate and well thought through risk allocation is the key to ensuring that the party best able to control risks are allocated those risks. Therefore, generally speaking, the contractor is the appropriate party who takes on the risks arising from the quality of work and any faulty workmanship and materials. This may extend to defective design. The employer, on the other hand, is better placed to take risks arising from their own fault or negligence, for matters under their control, and for matters not the fault of either party. With the collaborative nature of the NEC3, Section 8 has been drafted with the aim to encourage the parties to try and avoid, or at the very least, control risk. It should also be noted that for liability, the ECC apportions who is responsible by risk allocation, but that such allocation is not dependent on insurance. The obvious example is that under the ECC, and subject to any insurances expressly stated in the contract data, the employer is not under an obligation to obtain insurance for its risks that are not covered by any joint names policy to be provided by the contractor. Section 8 also does not deal with financial risks. These are dealt with elsewhere. For example, clause 60.114 states that the employer carries the financial risk if any events that are his risk occur. The ECC allocates risks by firstly setting out in clause 80.1 the employer's risks before widely defining those contractors' risks in clause 81.1 as those not carried by the employer. By being widely defined, the contractor's risk may cause uncertainty under clause 84.2 as the scope of cover the contractor has to provide is related to the contractor's risk. So looking briefly at the employer's risks under clause 80.1, these are listed on the following slides. There are 6 categories overall of the employer's risks. The first category relates to the employer's use of the site or works and may include, for example, unavoidable instances of nuisance, such as noise or dust from the site. The first category also has, as an employer risk, its own general or legal responsibilities and fault in his design. The second employer risk category relates to loss or damage to employer-supplied goods, which is typically plant and materials. Such risk exists until the contractor has received and accepted such plant and materials. The third employer risk category relates to non-insurable events, which is the equivalent of a typical force majeure clause. This risk is limited to the loss or damage to the works, plant and materials, but not to any delay that those events have caused. The fourth employer risk category relates to loss or damage after takeover, which further to clause 35.2 is when the employer begins to use that part of the works. Therefore, although the contractor has responsibility up to the defect certificate being issued with regards to its insurance obligations, some risks are in fact then superseded when the employer takes over all or part of the works. The fifth employer risk category relates to loss or damage after termination. This is straightforward and as to be expected once a contractor has left the site. The final employer risk category relates to any additional employer's risks the parties have agreed upon and that are expressly set out in the contract data. Such risks may then be covered by a project insurance policy. Thereafter, clause 81.1 sets out that the contractor's risks are those not covered by the employer. There is a time limit for those contractor's risks. This is up to when the defect certificate is issued. However, as I discussed previously, this may be shortened by way of the fourth employer risk category. Nevertheless, contractors and their insurers need to be aware of the time limit for such risks. There is a slide here about repairs. I don't propose to deal with this in any detail, but it's there for your reference. And we'll move on to consider clause 83, the indemnity clause. Clauses 83.1 and 83.2 are typical indemnity provisions, whereby each party indemnifies the other for events which are its risks, but that such liability is reduced on a proportional basis if the other party has contributed to the event. In addition, there will be applications to be made for a compensation event under clause 60.1(14), where applicable under an employer's risk. Under clause 84 of the ECC, there are the insurance cover to be provided and obtained by the contractor in relation to its risks. Strictly speaking, these operate only until the works are handed over to the employer, as most of the risks are transferred at this point. The table in this clause is further explained in the contract data, which, for example, usually sets out the events and the extent of cover to be incorporated into the applicable insurance policies. The contract data may also add insurances to be provided. For example, under the ECC, a professional indemnity policy is not required from the contractor. However, if the contractor is undertaking design work, the requirement to provide a PI policy is usually incorporated in the contract data. Consideration then has to be given for PI cover as to whether the X15 limitation of liability is incorporated. Otherwise, there is a risk of a fitness for purpose obligation, which typically will not be covered by PI. It is important to note that the contractor does not have to provide cover in respect of those insurances set out in the contract data which the employer is to provide. As such, when the contract is being negotiated, careful consideration has to be given between the division of responsibility for obtaining insurance cover. However, it may also be the case that the insurance to be provided by the contractor is already provided by their annual contractors all risk policy. Therefore, they may also have cover for events which the contract data provides should be provided for by the employer. By clause 84.2, the insurances to be provided by the contractor are to be in joint names, i.e. the contractor and the employer. It does not include any funders or subcontractors. It is the responsibility of the project manager with the contractor to ensure that the policies are in joint names, including those insurances to be provided by the employer. Under the table in clause 84, there are 4 types of insurance to be provided by the contractor. The first two types of insurance are the insurance of works, plant and materials, and insurance of the contractor's equipment. This cover should be for a minimum of the replacement costs, i.e. the actual value at the time, rather than new for old. However, the contract data may set out further sums that are to be insured in addition under such a policy. The third type of insurance is for third-party cover in respect of loss or damage to property and/or injury or death of a person. The minimum cover for any one event is stated in the contract data. Under this clause, the policy should have cross liability so that it will apply separately to the contractor and the employer. The final type of cover is for liability for death or personal injury to the contractor's employees. The minimum amount of cover is the greater of the amount required by the applicable law or as stated in the contract data. What is important to note is that Clause 84 does not include the project manager in the insurance requirements. This is presumably as it is expected that the project manager will have its own professional indemnity cover under the terms of its appointment. We then have a slide covering clauses 85 to 87, which sets out general rights and obligations in respect of insurance. Under clause 85.1, the project manager should ensure that the terms of the applicable policies satisfy the contract requirements and that the employer's interests are protected. This is an important obligation and one that cannot be overlooked. Clauses 85.2 to 85.4 are typical and they include the waiver of subrogation, but clause 85.4 should be noted as inferring that risk allocation is maintained irrespective of insurance. This is particularly so if there is a shortfall on recovery under such a policy. In practical terms, this means that if a risk is a contractor's risk, but is one that the employer insures against, when the risk occurs, the employer recovers from its policy. However, if the employer only recovers 75% of its loss or damage, for example, from the insurance policy, the contractor remains responsible for the remaining 25%. Therefore, it should be clear that the insurance requirements must be tailored to meet the specific requirements of the project. For example, if not expressly stated, there is no obligation on the employer to insure any existing buildings and structures within which work is to be carried out. In such a scenario, the contractor should, during negotiation, seek to have such cover provided by the employer. Clause 86 allows the employer to insure a risk which the contractor is to insure but does not. This is to ensure that there is no shortfall in the insurance on a project. Under Clause 87, the contractor has similar rights to consider insurances to be provided by the employer in accordance with the contract data. But as before, this clause on its own does not give rise to any obligation on the employer to provide insurance, whether against its risks or otherwise. So having had that quick tour through the risk and insurance provisions of the ECC, I'm now going to look at the dispute resolution provisions. There are two options for the dispute resolution clause in the ECC, W1 and W2. The parties must choose an option to be incorporated. W1 is used for projects that are not subject to the Construction Act 1996. As will be shown, the timings under this method of dispute resolution are designed to resolve disputes during the course of the works, and a right to claim can be lost. W2 is used for projects that are subject to the Construction Act 1996, i.e. are a construction contract in the UK. What is key is that all disputes must be referred to adjudication first. W1 has a bespoke timetable with restrictions on referring disputes. W2 is drafted to be compliant with the minimum requirements of the Construction Act and the scheme. Therefore, under an unamended ECC, the parties cannot go straight to court or arbitration. They must adjudicate first, although under option W1, a dispute can be referred to court or arbitration if it has been referred to the adjudicator. Under W2, it goes a step further, as it states the dispute must have been decided by the adjudicator. In terms of the forum following the adjudication, known as the tribunal, the parties specify in the contract data whether this is to be litigation or arbitration. There are some common features between options W1 and W2. A single adjudicator is appointed at the outset, and their appointment generally lasts for the duration of the project. This is set out in the contract data part 1. Provision will also be made for a nominating body if that adjudicator is unable to act. The employer names the individual adjudicator, and that adjudicator takes no part in the project unless a dispute is referred. This is in contrast to a disputes board where board members are regularly involved. The adjudicator can only deal with the dispute referred to him. In reality, this is no different to the jurisdiction of the adjudicator under other contractual or the statutory adjudication process. The adjudicator's decision is interim but binding. As such, the parties must implement the decision until they agree otherwise, or the dispute is finally determined by the tribunal. The adjudicator must give reasons for his decision. This then allows a party to consider whether they are dissatisfied with that decision. If they are dissatisfied and wish to challenge, that party must serve a notice of dissatisfaction. This has to be served within the time limit for taking this step of 4 weeks from the date of the decision. So what are the main differences between the options? Under W1 there is a defined procedure with timings which are a condition precedent to commencing an adjudication. Such timings are not compliant with the Construction Act. In particular, a party does not have the right to bring an adjudication at any time, unlike in W2. In addition, W1 has just 4 grounds of dispute with specific timings. The specific ground determines who can bring the adjudication. The first ground is where the project manager or supervisor takes an action which is disputed by the contractor. Where this is the case, the contractor has 4 weeks from the date he becomes aware of the action to notify the dispute to the employer and the project manager. The contractor must then refer the dispute to the adjudicator between 2 and 4 weeks of the notification. Under this first ground, it should be noted that the employer appears to have no recourse if it disagrees with the action of the project manager or supervisor. However, if the employer disputes a project manager's certificate, the employer can still withhold any sum certified, as under clause 51.1, the employer is to pay the amount due, not certified. The second ground is where the project manager or supervisor fails to take an action. Again, this is a claim for the contractor to bring, and it has the same time periods as the first ground. The third ground arises from a quotation for a compensation event which is treated as having been accepted under clause 62.6 or 64.4. In such circumstances, the project manager has failed to reply to a quotation or make an assessment. Where this is the case, it is the project manager who gives notice of the dispute to the employer and the contractor. This is to be done not more than 4 weeks after the quotation was treated as accepted. Between 2 and 4 weeks after that notification, it is the employer who must refer the dispute to the adjudicator. Under this ground, it appears that the contractor is bound by this quotation. The fourth ground covers any other matter. Although it sounds broad and either party can rely on this grounds, the adjudication must still be referred between 2 and 4 weeks after notification. Under clause W1.32, the timings can be extended by the project manager if the project manager and contractor agree before the notice or referral is due. But if a dispute is not notified and referred within the timings, then the party loses the right to refer. The procedure for the adjudication is also different. Under W1.33, the referring party includes with the referral information it considers relevant for the adjudicator to consider. Thereafter, any additional information is to be provided within 4 weeks of the referral, subject to any agreed extension. Therefore, a referring party can submit further information if it so chooses within 4 weeks of its referral. This may be necessary in the circumstances where not all relevant information could be gathered within the time periods I've previously discussed. Tactically, and subject to any agreed extension, a respondent could also take advantage of this 4-week period by not submitting a response until the final day. This would prevent the referring party from replying to such a response. Typically, however, this is avoided as under W1.35, the adjudicator has power to give directions. Under W1, the adjudicator's decision is due within 4 weeks of the end of the period to receive information, unless extended by agreement. In other words, under W1, there is an 8-week process from the referral to the decision, and taking it back a step, a 10 to 12-week process from the notification of the dispute to the decision, and for the first 3 grounds, 14 to 16 weeks from the date of the relevant event to the decision. Under W2, within 3 days of the notice, the adjudicator confirms if he is able to decide the dispute. If he is not, this allows 4 days for the referring party to go to the nominating body to have another adjudicator nominated. Within 7 days of the notice, the dispute must be referred to the adjudicator with all the information the referring party relies on. Further information from a party must be provided within 14 days of the referral, subject to any extension. Again, the adjudicator should manage the process with a timetable. The adjudicator's decision is then due within 28 days of the referral, extended by 14 days with the agreement of the referring party, or longer if all agree. It should be noted that under both options, the adjudicator can decide a dispute under the ECC and a dispute under a subcontract together if the subcontract so allows. Under both options, in reaching a decision that includes an assessment of additional cost or delay caused to the contractor, the adjudicator must make his assessment in the same way as a compensation event is assessed. Under W1.42 and W2.42, a party must serve a notice of dissatisfaction within 4 weeks of the decision to be able to refer the dispute to the tribunal. However, as I said earlier, under W1 there is the option to refer a dispute to the tribunal once it has been referred. The whole purpose of the ECC, and in particular the dispute resolution clauses, was to try and avoid the parties going to court or arbitration. For this reason, we see very little in the way of reported cases. What we have seen, though, is that when called upon, the courts have taken a common sense approach to interpreting the NEC, in particular the compensation event clauses. This should come as no surprise, as it follows the ethos of the NEC3 that all matters should be clear and allow the parties to work together to get the project completed. One case of interest on the slide that we just want to touch on is the Scottish case of SSE Generation v Hochtief from 2015. This case relates to an NEC3 ECC, but the guidance it provides on the interrelationship between the requirement for joint names insurance and liability between the parties is relevant to the NEC3. In this case, the employer sought to bring a claim against the contractor for damages arising from a tunnel collapse. In its defence, the contractor relied on a joint name CAR policy to contend that the employer could not pursue the contractor. Their only recourse was under the CAR policy. The court, aware of the importance not to merge insurance law and contractual interpretation, focused on the contractual wording. In this regard, under clause 83.1, there is an express statement that each party was liable to each other. If clause 84, the insurance cover clause, meant as the contractor contended, it would render clause 83.1 redundant. In addition, the underlying risk allocation between the parties, taking into account possible insurance recovery, was dealt with by clause 85.4. As such, the contractor decided that the employer was not contractually barred from bringing its claim. As I say, this was decided on the NEC2 wording. Careful consideration of the relevant contractual wording in other standard forms of contract would have to be given before these principles can be said to apply. I will now hand you back to Tom.
Thank you very much, James. And now we're just going to draw some conclusions and give a few practical tips in terms of best exercising any contractual obligations under NEC contracts in future, under any ECC contracts. Now, as with any contract, it's critical that the parties understand their contractual rights, obligations and risks prior to entering into an ECC contract. If operated properly, the ECC can be an effective project management tool in which the parties deal with problems as they arise, thereby mitigating or avoiding any further complications from the problem. Now, the number one tip for anyone entering into an ECC contract is to ensure that you understand and comply with the contract mechanisms from the outset, including issuing early warning notices and compensation event notices in due time. Now, to facilitate this process and compliance with the form generally, it makes sense to make use of templates and precedent forms, and wherever possible to agree a joint approach between the contractor and the project manager, pursuant to the obligation to act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. Of course, we can assist in that process, including in providing example templates and precedent forms for all the sorts of notices that have to be issued under an ECC contract. So turning now to future webinars, there will be a follow-up webinar, and possibly more than one, on the subject of the ECC. And on that subject, not only would we consider the payment options and the duties of the project manager and the other aspects of the form we haven't considered, but we'd also have an opportunity to answer in detail some of the very good questions that have been received in the course of this webinar. And I'll just go through a couple of them. Do we have any thoughts on the partnering option, option X12, quite a topical option in the context of the current the fashion for alliancing and all things collaborative? Are we going to discuss the 2015 clauses for early contractor involvement? Again, a very topical question. We see early contractor involvement being flagged up as one of the key requirements of the HS2 client, for example. Is there a conflict between the use of NEC3 ECC and the PSC unless the ECC is amended or at least has option X15 annexed to it? Very good question. I mean, I think I partly answered that without especially referring to the PSC, but I think the answer is that one does have to incorporate option X15 to ensure that, at least to some extent, the obligations of the contractor in relation to design are back to back with those of the designer, although the language is actually quite different even within option X15 from the relevant provisions of the PSC, and we can go into that in more detail in a future webinar. A more detailed question is, under ECC, who carries the risk for statutory providers, including gas, electrical suppliers and so forth? I can give a short answer now, which is that it largely depends on whether they are included within the definition of others under the ECC form, because i.e. are they a subcontractor or supplier of the contractor or not? If they're not a subcontractor or supplier of the contractor, then they are likely to be treated as others, and a failure by others to carry out their work in accordance with the accepted programme would be a compensation event. So the contractor has some protection there, but it largely depends on the contractual arrangements which are made in respect of the statutory providers, and that some information about that should be included in the works information. Again, we can come back to this in a future webinar. So at this point, I would like to say thank you all for listening with attention. We've covered a lot of ground in the last hour. It's been a lot to absorb. Of course, you're all free to go back to look again at the link through the link on the website when we publish the same in the next few days. And if there are any further questions that come out of the webinar or any suggestions for future topics, we'd be really grateful if you could let us know what they are. At that point, so we'll sign off and say thank you, everyone, and bye for now.